Many Americans have been asking perhaps one of the most common sense questions to be asked in recent political history after the atrocious performance of Joe Biden at the presidential debate. They have been asking the question, who is actually running the country?
Until we get the total ban on the total initiative relative to what we can do with more border patrol, dealing with everything we have to do with look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Now, before I actually give you guys the answer, because the answer is not what you think the answer is, I can assure you. And if you do think this is the answer and you get it right, then good on you, kudos on you. I have to say something. It's very important for us to contextualize our expectations with the realities we're confronted with. Sometimes our questions convey expectations that are not realistic or that are conceived and based upon naive romanticistic ideas that have no connection with reality. And I think this question is actually just one example and a string of examples that justify and prove this point. But we will answer it nonetheless. But before we answer this question, my friends, hello, I am your host, Christian Watson. Thank you guys so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary from a philosophical bent, I must encourage you, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, comment on this video, share this video, even if you disagree with me. This country needs something a little bit more than sensationalism and talking points. We need a revolution of the mind, and I believe that you and I together are going to be able to do that. And not just do it for the short term, but in the long term. And that will ultimately lead a revival in how the American political mind thinks about situations that are occurring within its country and affecting all of us in this unique American moment. So let's get on to the video now. Now, the question is asked by many people, many pundits, many commenters, who is actually running the country? And while, again, this is a common sense question, sometimes common sense is only the beginning of finding an answer. It is not always the answer itself. Sometimes it is. And if you're, by the way, if you are a lover of the American political and philosophical tradition, you will understand entirely that common sense is actually a system of philosophy built up by fundamentally American thinkers like Thomas Paine and Thomas Reid and the Scottish Common Sense Enlightenment School of Philosophy, which also helped build up our foundational principles and ideas. And so I'm not bashing common sense, but it's very important for us to contextualize common sense. Because the question, is Biden running the country, and if not, who is doing so, implies that the president actually runs the country. And it also implies a sort of romanticized view of our system that the executive still has level of power needed to execute their duties. And this is my problem with this common sense question, is that it ignores the realities that are before us in our current American political structure. The truth is, Biden does not run the country. He never did run the country. But I have a news flash for you. Most presidents before Biden, with the exception of Trump, and I'll explain in a second, they didn't run the country either. Because most presidents, ever since the beginning of the 20th century, I would go as far to say that, ever since, I would possibly say perhaps after Calvin Coolidge, but even maybe a little bit before that, every president that has occupied the Oval Office since the beginning of the 20th century, around about that point, has been hamstrung and restrained by an unaccountable bureaucracy called the managerial state, known as the administrative state, or to some, the deep state, that has entrenched itself into our structure of government by way of subversive court rulings, by way of new laws being passed, and by way of the branches of government that are meant to correct each other, giving up their authority to concentrate in the executive, and then sealing the executive off from political accountability, even from the president himself. This is what so-called civil service protections are. The president can't even manage the executive branch because of how deeply entrenched the managerial philosophy is in its corridors. So in all reality, those who run the country are not those who you see in the public talking to you and giving you policy prescriptions or making speeches. It is those who operate in the back rooms who are emboldened by over 125 plus years of American managerialism, which is in defiance to the original constitutional order that this nation was founded upon. Now let's go a little bit deeper here, because in order for us to appreciate this perspective, we must understand the history behind this perspective. So Woodrow Wilson is perhaps the best articulator of this managerial philosophy. And Woodrow Wilson said very clearly in an essay on administration, it's one of his most not widely read, but it's very important to read this essay. It's very important because it explains the philosophy of progressivism and the left over the past 120 plus years. And Wilson says that there must be a separation between what he calls administration and politics. So for Wilson, administration is the practical steps that government is run, in which government is run. Politics is the process by which the actions of the government are debated, that involves more abstract or so on and so forth ideas. I'll quote from Wilson himself. Wilson says in this essay, The Study of Administration, I quote, "There is another distinction which must be worked into all of our conclusions, which though but another side of that between administration and politics is not quite easy to keep sight of. I mean the distinction between constitutional and administrative questions, between those governmental adjustments which are essential to constitutional principle and those which are merely instrumental to possibly changing purposes of a wisely adapting convenience." So Wilson is clearly saying constitutional matters and administrative matters, i.e. matters that involve running the government and matters that debate the philosophy of the government, are separate and must remain separate. If they don't remain separate, you can't run the government. And this approach kind of reflects the broader progressive retreat from first principles thinking and from a sort of foundational moral ethos built in natural law and towards what I call common good thinking. John Dewey, one of the great villains of American education, by the way, just absolutely horrible in so many ways, he criticized the founding fathers for not understanding, or rather for not being applicable to the historical period of time that him and the other progressives lived in. So the progressive argument was not just that administration and politics must be separate, which brought forth the administrative state and its invulnerabilities, but it was also that you can't have eternal principles because every age is guided by the sentiments of those who live and nothing else. How foul is that? Because if this is true, then that means the eternal does not exist. That means nothing can be universal or universally applied. The foundations of everything that built up our country and everything that life itself requires today will fall apart. Think about logic for a second. Logic is based on some fundamental rules that do not change no matter if you're in Greece, if you're in Germany, if you're in Russia, or if you're in woke Berkeley with the blue-haired professor. The principles of logic still remain fundamentally the same. But Dewey and all of his friends were like, forget all of that and let's focus instead on how the community feels in the 1900s. And let's tailor our law, let's tailor our expertise solely towards the goals of people living in this time and no other time. Hence, brought the rise of the administrative state. Now, in a great essay called The Progressive Origins of the Administrative State, the author goes on to explain how this approach actually structured the next 120 plus years of American government. The author explains that the three core principles that are constituting our structure of government, the separation of powers rather, were actively dissolved by progressive political and social actions, which then brought rise to this entrenched managerial class. One of those, for example, there are three principles of separation of powers, the entire basis of our structure of government. The non-delegation principle, which is that a branch cannot delegate its ability to another branch. The non-concentration principle, which is that a branch cannot accumulate the power that belongs to other branches, which is kind of a corollary to the non-delegation principle. And second, the sort of accountability principle, as I call it, which is that administrative processes must be subject to political accountability. So you must have an administrative government, an executive branch, that is still subject to being accountable to the other branches. The progressives destroyed all of those. They concentrated power into regulatory bodies like the FTC and other groups, which had the ability to make rules, decide rules, oversee rules, and review rules, taking the ability of the legislative branch of Congress to do all those things, because Congress itself actually gave them that power. Then this is where we had the chevron deference. Congress would write these ambiguous laws, and then the managerial class would then be able to read in new meanings and new things, new actions into these laws, and therefore create new legislation without being accountable by fiat, so on and so forth. So all these principles that built up separation of powers were dissolved and destroyed. And that is how our country has been governed for so many years, through a technocratic system that is based on unaccountable bureaucrats. Now, Trump is an exception to this rule, because Trump actually opposed this deeply embedded infrastructure. Trump was the person who said that for every new regulation that is signed into law, 2 will go away. What this does is it deprives the regulatory administrative class of their ability to entrench themselves further into American life, and therefore challenges their jurisdiction and the efficaciousness of their fiat rulemaking, which was a threat to them. He did some other things too, but obviously he wasn't as effective as he could have been. He could have gone a step further and gotten rid of civil service protections, of course, but he was still effective in a way. And for that reason, they gave him hell. For that reason, they tried to make his life the worst thing ever. For that reason, he had a very complicated political existence. The truth is this: in the modern day, and after the progressive era, if you have a president of the United States that claims to be a president, he's not actually the president unless he makes active efforts using his constitutional authority to subvert and dissolve the administrative bureaucrats who are unaccountable to him by fiat. Now, of course, this is changing. The chevron deference principle, which was one of the most atrocious legal opinions written in the past 50, 60, 70 years, that has been dissolved by the Supreme Court, thank goodness. So the power of this class, this managerial class, is dissolving. But still, it is still deeply entrenched. And it's not just bureaucrats. It's also people at the heights of federal law enforcement. When you think of who is running the country in terms of diplomacy, well, did you know that the CIA director, the CIA director has a history, not just this one, but ones that were before, have a long history of actually conducting diplomacy for the United States, of actually going in the place of the Secretary of State and going in the place of other officials to conduct diplomacy for the United States. Now, the CIA and these institutions don't necessarily have the interest of the United States, or even the interest of the president, or even the interest of morality at hand. They have the interest of their own institution. One principle that you guys must understand is that these federal agencies, they are not guided by a universal ethos. They are guided by a particular ethos. The particular ethos of the CIA is to preserve the standing and power of the CIA, to preserve their classification schemes, which give them unique power over how our president understands and receives classified information, over how our adversaries are seen by the president. These are the people running the country. I can keep going on and on and on and on. It's not just the CIA director. There's plenty of other bureaucrats that take up functions that were not meant for them to go in and assert their own agenda. So the question is this, my friends. Instead of who is running the country since Biden is so deficient, how about who has been running the country for the past 120 plus years? When our constitutional order was subverted by managerialism imported from Prussia, which is fundamentally anti-American, and what are the responses of those people in that ruling class when their power, their illegitimate power, might I add, is challenged? Well, their response is to drag up all of their context in the media. Their response is to levy every single administrative tool at their disposal to crush dissent. Their response is to very simply clamp down like a dog getting its leg bit off and to try to survive. Have this anaphylactic response. And the response of the progressive left, which was quite evident, by the way, with the chevron deference case, is that they believe that the expert class and the administrative state are necessities for a society because they are more worried about government being administrated more than they're worried about government actually being good and government functioning according to where its appropriate processes and its an appropriate vision. So the only solution, my friends, is very simple. We have to recognize who the real ruling class is, Stop being distracted by Joe Biden's dementia and fight the permanent state whenever we can. Because to answer your question, those are the people that have been running our country. And those are the people, unfortunately, that will keep running our country if we keep getting distracted by the demented old man who is simply, in my opinion, an artifact, a relic, a sign of the demise of the institutional left. Laugh about that, clap for that, I don't care. I care about the people who have destroyed checks and balances, who have destroyed separation of powers, who have destroyed the American ethos of government and replaced it with a Prussian ethos of government, a European ethos of government. I care about those people because they are the threats to our republic, most importantly, and they are the ones who must be removed from power by abolishing the illegitimate positions of power that they themselves hold by virtue of fiat. So that's to answer your question, and hopefully this provides more clarity on the matter of who is running the country if Joe Biden is not. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe. Do whatever you can to get our message out there. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive.